Welcome back, and thanks again for joining us today. We are moving right along to another great session, and two down and four to go. So hopefully you'll be sticking with us for the rest of the day. We've got a lot of good stuff coming, another panel discussion, and three great presentations coming up as well. Just real quick, wanted to highlight what is available in the resource window. You can connect to our sponsor, Aesculap, directly on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out to them. And you can also check out the latest Beyond the Tour episode featuring Aesculap. So if you have some time, jump in and watch that episode. It's a great behind-the-scenes look at the intricacies and the operations at the Aesculap facility. Please feel free to follow Beyond Clean, First Case, and Power Supply on LinkedIn if you haven't already. We really encourage you to do that because we do have event updates and all kinds of good information, links to our podcasts, vendor spotlights. So please make sure to go ahead and follow us on those pages. Joining us today, again, is my colleague, Hank Balch. As I've said before earlier in today's sessions, he is the founder and president of Beyond Clean. He is a well-known industry writer and social media connoisseur on a mission to equip sterile processing professionals with the skills and knowledge to fight dirty every instrument, every time. Hank's presentation is titled Survey Says, the Data of Sterile Processing Education and Career Growth. How can sterile processing professionals leverage data to make informed decisions on their next career move? Survey Says, Hank is here to help find out. Hank joins us to showcase the eye-opening findings from a nationwide survey focused on the educational background, certification, and leadership training opportunities for sterile processing professionals. Get ready to discover Hank's valuable insights on the importance of ongoing education and challenging yourself to take the next step up your career ladder. All right, join us in welcoming Hank Balch.
What's up, Clean Freaks? Thank you for joining me for this session. Survey Says, the data of sterile processing education and career growth. I promise you this session is going to be different than you've ever seen before. We're going to talk about a topic that is brand new in the industry, and we love doing these kinds of sessions and topics, especially because it gives you that big takeaway that you can take back to your team, to your department, to your regional meetings, your next regional meeting, and say, hey, I know you haven't heard this yet, so let me tell you what I heard on the Beyond Clean conference this past week. So thank you so much for tuning in to this session. And I'm excited to not only talk about the data implications of this survey, but also talk about the practical career implications, how we educate, how we mentor, how we train. This is a far-reaching study, and we're just now scratching the surface of about what it actually means to individuals in sterile processing and to our departments and industry at large. So let's talk about what it is we're going to be talking about in terms of the data today, and then we'll dive in, like I said, to a lot of the details that the report has surfaced. As we go in here, I want to highlight our research team. So these are the folks who did the hard work out there of putting all the pieces of this puzzle together. Now, obviously, on the Beyond Clean side, we ran the survey itself. We conducted the survey, and if you remember, a couple of years ago, many of y'all probably tuning in had answered the questions to these surveys. And we did a couple of different surveys. We did an economic survey, talked about what folks are out there in the industry, what you're making for a wage, where you started, how you've grown, how much debt you have, did you go to college, did you pay for college, those kinds of things. We did a safety survey just talking about how safe you feel in your department, how many injuries, all those kind of contributing factors. And we did this career focus survey, this education survey, and that's going to be a lot of the data that we're going to be discussing today in this session. But the research team that put it all together, as I said, and published this peer-reviewed journal article are up there on the screen. The journal itself was Perioperative Care and Operating Room Management, and the title of this latest article that came out in the summer of 2023 is Do Formal Education or Certification Opportunities in Sterile Processing Enhance Career Advancement? So very important question, and we'll get to some of that in the rest of this session. But I just want to highlight this was a pretty large team, a lot of MDs on that list, a lot of sterile processing folks, obviously on our side of the equation to help conduct the survey. But the most important piece of this puzzle is not necessarily the names on this slide, but it's all your names, everyone who responded to that survey, because without responses, we have no data, and without data, we actually don't know what's true in the industry, what's actually going on, what works, what doesn't, and how do we improve the process. So this is just a shout out kind of at the beginning. Number one, thank you for completing the survey. But number two, for any of future surveys that you see from Beyond Clean, we're doing something with that data. We want to know, what is the reality on the front lines? What are you confronted with? What are you seeing? What do you like? What do you not like? And from that data, we're doing big things. We're publishing these big journal articles. We're making big shifts to how we educate as a company, as a brand, and how we collaborate with all of these other groups and agencies out there that do education and training in our space, and on just how we put together resources that help you as an educator, or you as a lead tech, you as a department manager to educate your team in your own sterile processing department. So thank you. And if I had the opportunity to put every single name that completed the survey on this screen right now, I would. All right. So let's talk about sterile processing here by the numbers, just as we get started here. Some of these numbers may be familiar to you, but there may be some numbers that, and this is the first time that you're actually seeing it. Sterile processing departments today currently employ over 60,000 individuals in the U.S. I know many of our audience is going to be from overseas, international audience, but for those of us in the U.S., 60,000, 60K in all kinds of form and fashion in our sterile processing departments, over 51 million surgical interventions per year in the U.S. Sterile processing employees themselves need to know patterns or types of instruments for cleaning, maintaining, and storing of upward of 20,000 different types of instrumentation. So that number in particular, you probably have felt this, right? Especially if you're a new technician walking in, you've probably been like, how am I going to learn all these instruments? There's so many. Well, you may have guessed maybe there's 500 different types, maybe there's 1,000 different types, but 20,000 different variations on average of instrumentation that the sterile processing professional has to keep in mind. And not just, hey, what is this? But then you have all the other piece of data points on, well, how do I clean this one of 20,000? How do I sterilize this? What's the parameters for that? Thankfully, there's more technology out there today, like tracking systems to help to short circuit some of that knowledge. But let me tell you, back in the day, as they say, back before the tracking systems, we got to hand it to our ancestors in sterile processing, because they had to keep all that information and all that data in their heads or in filing cabinets, in binders, right? And that's kind of where we run into in some of our older departments. You see those big filing cabinets in the back. You see all the cabinets, stacked full with binders. Well, that's what it was, because we're dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of different data points just on our instrumentation. So What does this calculate out into in terms of how many instruments the average sterile processing employee handles each year? And you can see that number on your screen, 500,000. Over 500,000, 557,357 instruments on average per year that the average sterile processing employee has to handle. So a ton of devices, a ton of different data points, if you will, are coming through our hands on a regular basis. Let me tell you, this job is complex. If you've been working in the industry for any amount of time, that's not news to you, but it's important for us as we get into the data that we're about to get into to really gather the scope and the difficulty of what it is we are asked to do when we clock in to our facilities. We're asked to make compliance out of chaos. Tens of thousands of instrument types, over 500,000 of instruments per year per employee coming through our hands, and all of the complexities, all the regulatory, all of the training and knowledge and process and policies of each one of our facilities is coming into play with each one of these instrument data points, and they're all touching, again, a patient at the end of the line. So very complex and very wide scope. Now, here's a couple of big bombs that came out of this journal article that we're going to be talking about in this session. And rather than save the bombs for the very end and go through all these data points and trying to put it together, I'm going to give you the bombs up front, right? So at the very beginning of this, we're going to drop the 3 bombs. And then we're going to talk through what all the data has told us through these surveys and how these bombs got surfaced. Now, it's important, again, I should have called this out at the beginning, but let me just say it here. This survey is the largest industry survey ever done asking these questions, right? So this is the best data out there to date. That's not saying that this is the best data that we're ever going to have in the industry. There should be more surveys, should be more questions. We want to continue getting at the root questions here that we've surfaced. But for where we are today in the industry and all of these questions, this is the best data that anyone has to date. And that's why some of these bombs are so big. All right, let's go in here to the first bomb. The first big bomb, the first big surprise in this data was this: formal training or certification in sterile processing did not correlate with a higher ranking position of employment. Now, if you remember back on the previous slide and you saw the title of the journal article, the question of the article was, do formal education or certification opportunities in sterile processing enhance career advancement? And the first big bomb here that we're looking at says, formal training or certification in sterile processing did not correlate with a higher ranking position of employment. Now, we're going to look at what the data says in this, but the translation of this into layman's terms is what we have assumed and been taught ever since I got into sterile processing as a new technician almost 14 years ago, and everything that we've probably been telling and teaching our new frontline technicians is, hey, get trained in these ways, get certified in these ways, and that's how you grow. Well, the data today says that's not actually true. That does not correlate with a higher ranking position of employment. We're going to dive into what the data does say, but it does not say this. All right. Number 2, the second of these 3 bombs, these 3 surprises that we saw in the data. On average, directors and managers were more likely to have 4 years master's or doctoral degrees when compared to technicians. Now, you may think, well, no surprise there, Hank. If you're comparing technicians and directors, of course, we would assume that directors and managers would have higher degrees. Now, the reason this is a bomb is because of what we learned in the first bomb, that the correlation on these higher positions is not tied to certification or any kind of formal training in sterile processing. What it is tied to is this: 4-year degrees, master's degrees, doctoral degrees. Those are the ones that highlight what and who's going to be a leader in sterile processing. And again, we're going to dive into that a little bit more. So the third bomb here, and this is one that I think is perhaps the most interesting one, obviously kind of busting this assumption and myth that we were taught all along of how do you grow in sterile processing. Well, you go get certified, you do these training programs in sterile processing, and that's how you grow. The data says that's not true. But maybe more importantly than that is this bomb. And this is: competence can be enhanced by way of education, certification, and leadership training. However, such preparation does not automatically translate to workplace performance. Again, this is an assumption that the data today, that this survey has really undermined and said, we need to question this assumption. The assumption out there historically has been, hey, if you get educated more, if you get more certifications, if you do more leadership training, that's going to make a better employee. That's going to make a better sterile processing technician. The data says, and this report says, that kind of preparation does not automatically translate to workplace performance. Now, it's not saying it never does, okay? If anyone believes in education and the power of education to do good in our industry, I believe it. We believe it at Beyond Clean. I know all of y'all who are sitting in this educational conference today and in this session, you believe that education is important and valuable, right? So we all believe these things. However, really coming at this assumption that it automatically creates better employees and better workers. You feed education, you feed leadership training, you get certifications, and then boom, you get better employees. The data says that's actually not what happens. And we're going to dive into some of that. All right. So I've been talking about the data. Well, let's get to some of the data. So 49% of respondents to the survey were sterile processing technicians. Another 16% were supervisors. Another 16% were managers. Another 5% were directors. Another 5% were educators. 2.5 were lead technicians, and then we had a little over 5 that said they had some other type of role besides those categories, right? So what's important here is this data is a pretty accurate gauge to what you probably would have assumed the demographics of the industry would have been out there, that we'd have almost half, if not a little bit more, would be technicians, and then all of these other ancillary roles, leadership roles on top of it as well. All right, the highest level of education. So this is kind of going into a little bit of the setup for one of the bombs. 28% of respondents had some form of college in their background. 21% graduated from a 4-year program. 19% graduated from a 2-year program, and 12% held a GED or had graduated from high school. 10% had a technical school degree, and 7% held a master's degree, 7%. In comparing the highest level of education and the highest level of employment achieved, technicians were statistically more likely to have plateaued either at a GED, at a high school diploma, or some college work without a 2 or 4-year degree, compared to all other groups, and were significantly less likely to hold a 4-year college degree or master's degree. All right, so that's technicians. In contrast, those with the title of manager or director were statistically more likely to have completed a 4-year college degree. Your educators, directors, and managers were statistically more likely to hold a master's degree compared to all other groups. So again, this is one of the bombs. The data says managers, directors, educators, they are statistically more likely to have college degrees, 4-year college degrees. And in particular, if you're an educator, director, or manager, they're statistically more likely to hold a master's degree compared to all other groups. And this is important again because what the data did not say is that more certifications statistically lead to you becoming a manager, a director, or an educator. And that is what is often preached traditionally and historically in our space without a lot of data like this that actually backs it up. All right. So half of respondents had formal educational training after high school in sterile processing. So that means about half of us out there today have done some kind of formal training in sterile processing. The average length of these programs was anywhere between 6 months or so, all the way down to a couple of months. And you see the big bell curves kind of there at the 4-month, the 7-month, and the 13-month training program, which that aligns with what we see in the industry kind of clustering around that 3 to 4 months, that 6 to 7, or that 12 to 13 months. Interestingly, completing this type of formal education in sterile processing, again, did not correspond with a higher level of employment. And this was true across all positions in SPD. These kinds of training programs, according to the data, does not correlate automatically to career growth. One of the challenges that this data surfaced was we're seeing new hires with mismatched experience and education being mentored by existing employees until they demonstrate competencies in each of their specific tasks. This poses a challenge at most institutions where techs, nurses, and OR personnel are already short-staffed and we've got high turnover. So what that happens is we've got gaps in various insight and knowledge from our trainers and our preceptors. They're trying to train new technicians that are coming in with varied backgrounds, right? So about half of them are coming in with some kind of formal training. The other half are just coming in with zero sterile processing background whatsoever. And then they're being trained by preceptors who also have like all kinds of mismatched training and formal training in their background. And those preceptors are also being asked to process and be an active employee at the same time that they're supposed to be training these folks in these various programs. And so it just creates, we all know it, but it surfaced in the data. A broken training program creates broken competence, and then we end up releasing these new technicians out of their orientation, and they're still missing some competence and some knowledge around the workflows and around the policies and procedures in our departments. And so it's a really sad thing that that's going on, but obviously it's not surprising to see that in the data. All right. As I was saying, we know that on-the-job training is difficult in any field, but in healthcare in particular, it's also potentially dangerous, right? So downstream harms include potentially patient infection, surgical site infection, injuries to staff, delays in required steps in the procedure, and even damage to critical and costly instrumentation. It also has intangible effects, including decreased morale, team performance and dysfunction, increased absences, and increased employee turnover. Again, no surprise, everyone wants to work with a high-performing team. We want to be around high performers. We want to work with people who know what they're doing. And we don't, if anything, as individuals, we want to be the weakest link. Right? We want other people to know more than we know about a department and about the workflow. We don't want to be the ones that are constantly feeling like there's no one else around that knows any more than me, because that means, again, that there's dysfunction, there's issues across the team. And when that happens, just like the data has shown, you get more call-ins, you get lower morale, you get dysfunction because people just cannot humanly carry the load of the entire department on their shoulders for that long. Even if they're not physically doing all the instruments, that mental load of if there's something wrong, it's going to be my fault because I'm the trainer, even though I don't have enough time to train or even though I haven't given all the resources to train. So it's a really big problematic deal. And even though we know the gaps exist in these training standards, as an industry, they're often overlooked or at least they're unsupported. There's no solution today, standardized solution to fix those problems. Education by role in sterile processing. So some institutions do invest in educating their sterile processing employees by hiring or designating a sterile processing educator. This exists for a minority of facilities. So we're looking at about 41% of respondents who said they've got a dedicated educator in their departments. And even those departments with a dedicated educator, they do not really protect the educator's time for education, with over 30% of their time being spent doing normal technician work outside of their teaching role. And I can hear all the educators who are watching this say amen. That's our life. And it's probably potentially even more than 30% now. You know, this data is already a year or two old. And with the staffing trajectory that we've seen today, I'm sure that you have an even smaller percentage of your time to actually dedicate to education. So this leaves most employees without consistent guidance or regular access to educational opportunities. And you can kind of see this question here. Do you get education in your sterile processing? And so you can kind of see the answer there. You know, technicians, yes, technicians, no, supervisors, and on down the line. I'll give you a moment just to look at those numbers here. All right, so this data is interesting data as well. The majority of respondents to this survey held at least one certification in sterile processing, with the most common certification being that CSPDT certification, and on down the line to the CRCST, the CSIS, all the way down to other certifications. But that's interesting data there, but most interesting again that 92% held at least one certification, and based on the total number of responses, the data indicates that the average respondent actually holds one or more certifications. But again, this is one of the bombs. Certification itself did not correspond to a higher ranking position of employment, unlike what the assumption is today that more certifications or quicker certifications, that's the roadmap to lead to growth in your career. The data today does not say that is actually panning out. All right, certification by role. This is very similar to one of the previous slides we saw earlier. So we just asked the question, are you certified? And you can see the yeses and nos are based on the roles. Interestingly, and this, if you think about it, it's maybe not as surprising as the numbers may say, but you can see you got the no's for technicians. They say, no, they're not certified. You got the supervisors, that number goes lower. Well, then you got managers. So that number of no, we're not certified in sterile processing, that jumps there from 6 to 11. And then you go to director, and the number goes down, but the number is still a little higher maybe than you may think of directors that do not have certification in sterile processing. And this goes back to the bomb. The surprise in the data is, hey, we got a number of managers and directors in the industry today that do not hold sterile processing certification. There's reasons for that. There's stories around that, and perhaps those are conversations for another day, but I just want to call that out. That's one of the reasons, and these are the data points that led to that correlation conversation that we've been mentioning. All right, so certification statistics. This is a very busy slide. I apologize for all the numbers, but I do want to walk through a few of these quickly here. So we've got the different credentialing organizations, and we've got the 2022 certification statistics. Maybe most interesting here are the numbers of exams that are passed. As you see there at the top, the CRCST, for instance, about 9,000 exams administered and about 6,800 passed. And so we've got a substantial percentage of those exams that are being taken that were failed. Very similar there as you go down to the CIS. You see about 700 exams administered and about 500 were passed. Skipping down to the CBSPD section, you can see the numbers of exams administered and the number of exams that were passed through those various certifications. Now, not all exam failure is due to the studying habits of the certification testers. These exams, both exams, all these exams, any exam is built to not be easy, right? And so if we're seeing pass rates of 90, 95, 100% pass rates, that's actually not a good thing. That's telling us that the certification exam itself is not rigorous enough. Now, that being said, we do know that there's a temptation in the industry, or this is another one of those assumptions, to feel like, hey, if you worked in the industry long enough, sterile processing, there's no need to study for these exams. Just go schedule it and take it. And oftentimes there's a very big surprise at the end of that, because the exam is not about what you know in your experience as a sterile processor. The exam is about what the textbook itself, what the standards are asking and testing against all those materials. So you do need to study to pass these certification exams. That's the big takeaway on this slide. Common areas of additional coursework. Now, this is very important. This is not one of the bombs, but it could have been a bomb in the fact that the findings show, and I think we've got another slide here in 2 slides, it's going to really call this out, but the findings show that our industry is hyper aware of and sees tremendous value in self-educating, regardless of the impact to career growth. Clearly, we didn't have the data before to tell us this, but the fact, again, that you're even watching this session is confirmation that you value self-directed education. You saw this conference, you saw this session, you said, I am going to go and pursue that education. That is a marker, a very unique marker in sterile processing. And I think it's very unique across healthcare. We're one of the most passionate and engaged self-educating niches in all of clinical education in healthcare, and definitely within surgical services. We pursue education for the merit of education because we want to know these things as an industry now. And I think there's another reason for that too that we'll speak to here in a moment. But as we're pursuing additional education, these are the various subjects that kind of came out of this survey that folks like to dig into. So number one, the biggest category was infectious diseases, biofilm, and bioburden. No surprise there. We want to know what is it that's coming into decontam that could hurt us, and then how do we kill it and keep it from hurting patients. Number two on there, inventory management, another big one, especially when you view inventory as all of the surgical instruments, all the trays, all the supplies that have to be constantly juggled around to support the growing surgical volumes. So very big topic there. Instrument language, huge in the early days of your career to just identify what it is you're looking at. What is this called? And then as you progress in your career, especially as you get into maybe more of the specialist roles, the educators, the quality assurance, the instrument coordinators, and the department managers, that instrument language becomes even more important because then you're making decisions around count sheets or reference cards or pick lists, and all that language has to meet up to each other for our data to be coherent and successful. And again, we're going to talk more about data throughout the rest of the data conference. Water chemistry. Now, this is one, again, this data is about a year and a half old. But I'm guessing this water chemistry one's going to just continue to grow with the new guidelines coming out from Amy around water quality in sterile processing. But we want to know about water, informatics, and system engineering and other categories round out the bottom there. The average respondent to this survey completed 2 or more courses related to sterile processing on top of whatever was required in their role. So they're really seeking out, we are really seeking out ongoing growth of knowledge and understanding as industry clinicians outside of what's required. All right, so these next 2 slides here are going to talk about the frequency here. The majority of respondents, 84%, engaged in self-directed learning outside of continuing education, certification, or coursework, right? So this is stuff that's not required, and folks just said, I want to learn it anyways. Over 60% engaged in self-directed learning at least monthly or weekly. And so you can see those percentages there on the far right. 41% said every single week, I am pursuing something new on my own, not my educator, not my manager. I'm deciding to go out there and learn something new. That is a staggering number, again, compared to other sectors of healthcare. We want to know, we want to grow in SPD. And you can see the rest of those numbers throughout the month, every 2 months, every 6 months, and every year. I guess now's a good time maybe to call out the second to last line on that slide that says never pursue self-directed learning, that 15%. Even that isn't as bad as it sounds, because again, this is outside of your certification, your CEs, or other required coursework. So even these people who never pursue self-directed learning, they're still being engaged in and with ongoing education on a regular basis throughout the life of their department, just by nature of the job itself. So really important there to call out. All right, so this is kind of visualization there by role of the breakdown in pursuing this self-directed learning. Interestingly, and you can see here on the blue bars, over 50% of your supervisors, your managers, your directors, and your educators are pursuing self-directed learning on a weekly basis. Anyone who has ever been in one of those roles knows why. For you technicians here, I'm just going to kind of tell the secret. So nothing magical happens when you get that promotion into one of the roles, right? So you know everything that you knew the day that you were a technician as what you know the next day when you get promoted to supervisor. Same thing. You know everything that you know the day before you become a manager and the day that you know after the manager. So in getting these roles, many times it sparks that reality of, oh, now I'm the person that people are going to come to with these random questions. I always used to go to the supervisor, I always used to go to the department educator, to the lead tech, I always used to go to someone else to ask that question, and now I'm that person. And nothing spurs ongoing self-directed education and learning as realizing I need to have answers now to these questions. Now, what probably happens on a practical standpoint is a lot of this self-directed learning occurs because they get a question they don't know the answer to, which is okay. And then they say, hey, give me a couple of minutes. I'm going to go back and I'm going to go check that out. I'm going to Google around. I'm going to read some articles. I'm listening to some podcasts. I'm going to watch some webinars. I'm going to come back tomorrow and maybe we'll do an in-service about what I learned. So I got to think a large percentage of this ongoing weekly self-directed learning is actually being prompted by questions from our technicians. So the call to action now for all you technicians tuning in is, hey, yeah, bring your questions. If you confront something and you don't know, it's not a commentary on you or your knowledge or your training. What it's doing, it's surfacing a gap across the entire department, and now you could bring your supervisor and your educator and your manager who may know the answer just right off the bat. They may have already done self-directed learning 2 years ago on that topic. But if they don't, it's then feeding into these blue lines. It's giving them another thing to go out there to search for those answers for you. So all of this is good information again. And I just love seeing all of these light blue bars and all of these roles and seeing how high they are for weekly self-directed learning. All right. Information sources on this self-directed learning. So the top sources of educational information were educational websites at just under 83%. Then you go into vendor websites that were 72%, just under 73%. And you go into non-peer reviewed publications. So these are your more traditional magazines and such. You got 58% there. In peer-reviewed journals, so this is the type of journal article that prompted this session, right? So it's a peer-reviewed journal article. Now, these tend to be much more highly researched, and obviously because you've got peers that are reviewing them, they're asking questions and making sure that the data makes sense before anything is published. And then you got social media, which of course is one of Beyond Clean's favorite places. At 29% of folks are getting their learning off of social media. And then you've got the rest of the categories there of other or none of the above. For those employees that are seeking resources for self-directed learning, there is an inconsistency that I want to pull out that surfaced out of this report. Existing recommendations out there provide vague and endless lists of potential resources and sources of information, right? So you can get it. You can learn from the safety data sheets, department policies. You can learn from your procedure manuals, different educational videos, relevant seminars, department in-services, journals, websites, and more. But the problem is, in all of those, you could be getting conflicting information about the same topic, especially in coming to various social media channels, if they're the kind of social media channels, for instance, like on Facebook groups, that anybody can weigh in with what their opinion is on the topic or the question. And I love the format because it prompts good conversation and engagement. But in terms of getting correct answers consistently without also getting incorrect answers coming in on that same comment thread, there's a real danger and a risk there if then you're putting your faith in the answers that you're getting, particularly on various ones of those social media channels. So I'm not saying don't use them. They're fun. I use them. I'm there. And I am saying don't necessarily trust everything that you see on the internet. No surprise, right? Your parents probably already told you that. Okay. The majority, 84% of sterile processing employees who use and engage in self-directed learning do so via internet searches, right? And so we're going to Google, or the second biggest internet search engine, if you didn't know, is actually YouTube, right? So folks are going to Google or to YouTube, and they're Googling in or they're YouTubing their question and then ending up at these various resources and sites here. But again, as I alluded to, the information that they're finding here is often inconsistent with one another and may or may not be appropriate to what it is they're actually wanting to do, the answer that they're actually wanting to get. So this represents a lost opportunity to enhance organizational capacity to provide high quality care. Or to translate that another way, it can cause a lot of confusion and actually slow down progress in your department if you've got different people Googling at different places with the same question, coming back with different answers, and then there's no real clear guidance on, well, whose is the right answer now that we've got all this insight, right? So that's one of the dangers and risks out there. Institutionally organized in-service training. So these are the traditional in-services there. So survey says, yes, 77% of all you folks out there that responded to the survey were doing some kind of organized in-service. Now, what's striking here is 16%. That's not a small number. And if you add in that other 5% of, well, I'm not sure if we do this or not, which is also not a good sign. If you don't know if you actually do in-services, that's getting us close to 20% that's potentially not doing regular organized in-services in your departments. The call out here is a little dramatic. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but we've been talking about self-directed learning, but obviously these in-services are organized learning. So these are the things that your team and your department need to be aware of. And we've got data saying that up to a fifth of our departments out there are not having regular in-services. Definitely a problem and definitely a gap, which probably leads to more folks saying, well, I'm not getting regular in-services in my department, so I'm going to go educate myself however I can, which is a good thing. It's a good thing that they're educating themselves however they can. It's not a good thing that we don't have enough in-services. Just want to clarify that. What's the frequency of these in-services? Because, let's not just assume that these are happening every week. What does the data say? Starting at the bottom there, 9% of our departments out there are having regular weekly in-services. We see kind of up there to above every month is the highest percentage at 35%. So that seems to be most departments out there. If they're having organized in-services, they're having them once a month. And secondly, you see that every 6 months. So they're just having them twice a year, which it's a good thing that you're having them twice a year. And if you add up that yearly and that twice a year, which is probably not enough, you're already looking at, 32% or so. So we got a lot of work to do in this in-service space. And that's what the data is kind of pulling out here to tell us. The next couple of slides here, we're going to kind of round up on leadership training, right? A big purpose of this session was to highlight what's the data saying about implications for career advancement and leadership. So 55% of all respondents reported that their facilities did not provide support for leadership training, and the overall likelihood of completing a leadership training course was statistically lower for all respondents if the employer did not pay for it. No surprise, right? If they're not providing it and they're not paying for it, we're likely not going to take it, but the data just confirmed that. Now, on the flip side, respondents were significantly more likely to complete them if they were reimbursed by their institution. Likewise, they were significantly less likely to complete them if they're not reimbursed. So this goes back to a practice that is done in some instances out there, I think, for attending conferences many times. You'll see those justification letters that you give to your manager, that you give to your manager's manager, and say, hey, this is why I want to justify an education budget, to send me to this conference. But it looks like data says that we also probably need some justification letters that provide access to leadership training in our facilities, and specifically in our sterile processing departments. And we need justification for the departments to pay for that training, that leadership training, because otherwise the data says we're not going to have folks that are taking advantage of that on a regular basis. The caveat, though, to that data says a subgroup within those numbers and show that supervisors, managers, directors, and educators were significantly more likely to complete training in leadership than technicians. And the reason, again, that that's important is going back to one of the bombs in this survey, what's correlating, what's contributing to career growth in our industry. And we saw that the most important factor is college degrees, is what the data says. Going back to the, hey, did your department pay for it or not on this slide, if you're a supervisor, director, and management, you were statistically more likely to get your training paid for than your technicians, your lead techs, or your educators. A lot of sterile processing employees will seek out training, but as we've seen from the data, most facilities do not support that. The problem is the lack of standardized career pathways with education and certification and advanced training leave all these organizations kind of in the lurch, because unlike our other roles within surgical services, such as the doctors and the nurses and even the surgical technologists, who all have very clear educational pathways and industry pathways to get into their careers. They're all standardized. You go to nursing school, you graduate, and then you go into nursing. Same thing with med school, same thing with your surgical technologists. Sterile processing in most states in the United States do not have any standardized career pathway, and even the few states that do have required certification, that pathway, as we've seen here with the data, does not correlate to actual career growth. So you may get a job in sterile processing because you're certified. That's clearly part of the momentum and the trajectory in there in terms of requiring certification across the states. But the data says the most important thing that can contribute to your career growth in sterile processing is actually a college degree. All right. So I just threw a whole lot of data at you in about 50 minutes, 55 minutes here. So I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes here talking about the story of what it is that you just heard, right? All the bombs that we talked about at the beginning, all the implications for this data, all of the challenging our assumptions in the industry. What does this mean? What should you take away from this session and do practically? Well, number one, I think the story here is we need more data on these questions. Even though this is the largest survey that's ever been done on these topics, and even though we were able to surface a lot of great information, there's still a lot of unanswered questions here, as you can probably see, in regards to if these things are not working, can they work? Is there something that we can do to our educational programs, to our certification programs, to actually make them work, to make them impact career growth? We don't know. Maybe so, maybe not, but we need more data to show that. What about these college degrees? Who's paying for the college degrees? Can we get hospitals to pay for college degree programs for technicians that want to get them and want to learn? Many hospitals do pay for degree programs, but oftentimes that's very specific to what you can major in. Many times they only offer certain amounts of money per year, per semester. You've got different grade requirements. So there's a lot of questions out there in the industry for if the goal is advancing technicians who want to grow in their careers, we still need more data to say what works. What we've seen in this data, in this survey, is our assumptions for what worked and what grew folks was actually not supported yet with data. Number 2 or 3, I forget where I am in the list, but we are an industry of driven, passionate clinicians who, regardless of career growth, we see the value of education. And this survey only confirmed that we are self-educating in tremendous percentages. We're oftentimes looking at all kinds of different sources out there for information to answer questions for our technicians, for our teams, as we talked about, but also just to improve our own scope of understanding in the space. What that means is we are a highly valuable workforce in all of healthcare because we know how to educate ourselves. Now, I'm not asking anyone, and I don't want anyone to grow outside of sterile processing. I don't want you to go somewhere else. I want you to stay here with us. But out of everybody out there in healthcare and in surgical services in particular, we can go pretty well anywhere we want to go because we know how to learn. We know how to educate ourselves and add value to ourselves and to whatever department that is that we're working in, which is why so many of us end up going into surgical techs, or end up going into the OR as nurses, or end up going to med school, or end up going to work for vendors, or end up going to anesthesia, end up going to ER, end up going to respiratory therapy. You know it. This is why we're all so comfortable going different places, because we understand the value of education and we pursue that with passion. Now, the challenge here, and one of the big takeaways with regard to education that the survey showed, is there's a lot of inconsistency with what's out there in the space. There's a lot of different answers to the same questions. And the challenge before us, and one of the big takeaways for this report, is as an industry, we need to come together to create an agreed upon pathway to not only get into the industry, which is kind of what certification gives us, but how do we grow once we're in the industry in a way that we're all learning similar things at similar stages in our careers, and it's not every man for himself trying to figure it all out through Google and through YouTube. That's the challenge that has been laid before us. As we talk about oftentimes here at Beyond Clean, as you've probably heard me say, outside of just getting the job done, we want to create a culture in sterile processing that people love what they do. And the good news about all this data, outside of the big bombs, is it has confirmed that we do love it. We love it in spite of growth. We love it in spite of the challenges. We love it in spite of all the confusions and all the issues out there. We love learning about sterile processing, and now we have data to prove it. It's not just some of us. We are an industry of clean freaks that love what we do, and we love learning to do that better. Coming out of this session today, the most valuable thing that you can do is go back to your department, to your office, to your home, sit down and map out everything that you have done in your own career. If you're a brand new student, if you're a brand new technician, if you're 5 years in, if you're supervisor, manager, director, if you've been there for 30 years, sit down and really evaluate what opened doors for you in your own experience. And notate, was it a good mentor? Was it the right time, the right place? Was it a good work ethic? Was it your college degree? Was it a resume that someone helped you put together? Was it recommendations from your industry peers? Was it all your involvement in your local chapters? Was it getting published? Was it speaking? What were those tangible things that helped you grow in your own experience, and lining up with the data that we now have as an industry that says, where are the gaps in career growth? And let's work together, let's talk together and do more data, get more data, and do more research to put all these pieces together, because we don't all grow the same way. That's something that we can know even without the data, but now the data has shown we don't know how to grow yet in sterile processing, or if we do, as individuals, we have not as a group shared that, all that knowledge, all that experience, all that insight into a pathway that is repeatable for all of our technicians that are coming into the industry today. So that's my big challenge and my big takeaway. I'm going to put the link to the report and the journal article in the notes here, maybe in the Q&A, so you can get access to that if you want to read more and see all of this data. For now, I want to thank you for tuning in. I know it was a lot of data, a lot of numbers thrown at you, but hopefully you found value in this, that you were challenged. And again, I think you just challenged like, oh, okay, that's good, that's interesting. I'm going to keep doing what I've always been doing. I hope you're challenged to think differently and do differently in your department today. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm going to turn it over now to our host.
All right. Thanks, Hank. That was a really good and informative presentation with a lot of really interesting findings. And as you said, I think there is a lot more to this discussion, a lot more to be found through more market research and just in terms of education. I love the fact that you highlighted how sterile processing professionals are just really, really engaged when it comes to self-learning. So that was a really great takeaway from that. if you guys want to reach out to Hank directly in terms of this presentation and you have more questions for him, please feel free to do so. Unfortunately, we're running short on time, so we really can't get to any live Q&A. So please feel free to reach out directly to Hank. As you know, he's very, very responsive on LinkedIn and also via email. So he's a valuable resource. We're looking forward to having more in terms of the conversation surrounding this topic, because data is good when it comes to just I would say throwing out the actual findings, but it also is a good conversation piece to actually elevate some more in terms of what we think we can do to help elevate our profession. So thanks again, Hank. Thanks all of you for joining us. We've got another session coming up here in about 10 minutes. So feel free to take a break, grab a quick snack, and we will be right back in 10. Thanks, everyone.